Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Today we have the first of a series of conversations with Australian politicians about strategy and security, the challenges our nation faces, and what to do about them. To kick things off, we have Liberal Senator and Shadow Finance Minister James Paterson.
James is one of the most thoughtful people in Parliament on strategic and national security issues. He's had strong involvement in security and defence for many years, including as Shadow Home Affairs Minister and Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and it really comes through in this conversation. He's very clear at a high level on what the issues are, but also very nuanced about the complexities, the balancing that any government has to consider, the trade-offs for the Australian people, and the dramatic shifts that are taking place around the world. For instance, he's a champion of the US alliance, but he's not shy about the fact that the US is going through what he calls an unconventional moment in politics.
Yeah, it's admirable understatement. In fact, I'm stealing somebody else's joke here, but he could be given the honorary UK citizenship for understatement there. If not for the fact that you can't sit in the Parliament and have dual citizenship, of course, as we painfully found out a few years ago. So anyway, we're aiming for these conversations not to be overtly political or partisan or too reactive to breaking news. That said, the French government had just collapsed for the second time in a year when James and I were speaking, so we got that into the conversation. But really, we're talking about the issues that transcend daily politics. So James and I talked about key strategic challenges facing Australia, the need to deter authoritarian powers, particularly China, the need for clarity about what we're doing, why we're doing it, the role for higher defence spending and how to achieve it in a fiscal sense, the role for technology in boosting our economy so that we don't get left behind by the transformative power of AI in particular.
Finished with AI again this week, Dave.
Yep.
James also talks about the responsibilities of the tech industry, the risks of tech dependence on China, the value of an open economy balanced against the need to safeguard strategic and critical industries, and ultimately how we knit all this together to strengthen the nation and prepare ourselves for the rest of the century. And he finishes on a really strong point about prioritising the needs of future generations so that they don't become disillusioned.
It's a very fair point. You're closer to the future generations than I am,
Thanks,
Liv,
Dave.
but
Couldn't agree more.
But yes, it's hard to deny, and it's good that James is prepared to talk about these big things. Anyway, it was a good conversation, and we felt that it was important to give our elected representatives the chance to talk, not just about the daily politics, but also the bigger picture. So we will be back with more episodes of the MPs series soon, but in the meantime, listen out for our regular episode later this week. Senator James Paterson, thanks for joining Stop the World.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get a sort of overview from you to start with. You've held a number of roles that are very relevant, PJCIS Chair, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Cyber Security, and now Opposition Spokesman for Finance. So you've got that rare vantage point on the intersection of security, economy, technology, which is really what I want to be talking about. Perhaps just a broad start. Give me a quick burst on what you see as the key strategic challenges facing Australia at the moment.
Well, the defining strategic issue for my generation and for the country as we know it today is the changing geopolitical environment, which is being driven by rising authoritarian powers. You don't need to have access to classified intelligence to see that the Chinese government is engaged in the largest build-up in peacetime of military capability since World War II, and they're accompanying that build-up with pretty menacing rhetoric about how they intend to use it. And I think history teaches us that when authoritarian states engage in massive acquisition of military capability and then tell us how they plan to use it, we should take that very seriously and we should respond. And the only way that a self-respecting liberal democracy and a regional power like Australia that has global interest can respond to something like that is to try and work with like-minded partners to prevent conflict through deterrence. And what that requires of us is a couple of things. One, we need to be very clear about what it is we're trying to deter, who it is we're trying to deter, what it is we're trying to deter them from doing. We need to clearly communicate our intent to do so, and we need to work with like-minded partners to invest in our capability so that we are credible when we communicate those messages. But if any of those elements fall down, if we're not clear what we're trying to deter, if we're not clear what we're trying to deter them from, if we don't invest in the capability needed to do so, and if we don't work with our allies and clearly communicate our intent, then we will fail, and the consequences of failing could be catastrophic.
Great start, and lots to unpack there. Perhaps we should actually start with the extent to which we are and are not working well with like-minded allies. I mean, and not just from Australia's perspective, but I suppose the coalition of liberal democracies that at least we can look to for that kind of cooperation to have a shared deterrence. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to be a bit despondent about that. I'm going to go straight to the recent news as we're speaking. There's been a collapse of the French government for the second time in less than a year, obviously coming at a time when Europe is facing severe interference from Russia, and when we're really relying on those major European powers, notably France and Germany, to be strong and decisive. It's very, very difficult to see that happening. We can see populists, no doubt, coming along with fairy tale solutions, at both ends of the political spectrum, and that that tends to have its consequences that we've seen before. I just want to note a quote from the outgoing French Prime Minister Bayrou. I'll start this again. He told the parliament, "You have the power to topple the government, but you don't have the power to erase reality." I thought that summed it up really well. Perhaps just your reflections on that, and I suppose just the broader concern about chaos in liberal democracies, political chaos, the potential for vulnerabilities that are exploited by rivals. Just your reflections on that, please.
Well, for obvious reasons, I don't want to comment on domestic French politics and cause an international diplomatic incident, but I probably should observe for context that this is not the first time a French government has fallen over a budget issue. This is a common occurrence in French politics, but at this strategic moment, it is a worrying one. Let's be candid about that, because we do need liberal democracies to step up and recognise the reality of the strategic moment that we are in and respond, and we cannot allow outside forces to take advantage of our system of government and weaponize our divisions to try and weaken us. Because if they're successful in doing so, then we will not be able to effectively respond to the challenge that they pose to us. And I understand for democracies, we are called upon right now to make hard choices, but there is no avoiding those hard choices. I'm a classical liberal. I believe in free markets and small government. I would much rather be cutting taxes and returning as much money to taxpayers as we could than to be increasing defence spending. But I recognise that we have responsibility to the existence of our nation state and future generations to invest in defence now as deterrent, because ultimately it's a false economy. If you underinvest in your defence deterrent and you find yourself failing to deter adversaries and finding yourself in conflict, you'll ultimately pay far more than just in dollars, and you will also pay in dollars if you fail to do so. And in the case of what Europe is facing right now, this is not a theoretical future threat or risk. It's an ever-present real one that they're facing today. And deterrence did fail in Ukraine. That's why we have a war today, because the deterrent was not sufficiently credible and serious. And what Europe has discovered is if you underinvest in your defence industrial base for decades, as they did, that it cannot respond just by flicking on a light switch. It's not going to be there when you need it to be just by increasing defence spending. It takes years to rebuild that industrial capability to respond. And in the meantime, your adversaries can make great gains at your expense.
So identifying who we need to deter seems to be less of an issue for Europe, for European leadership, and presumably for European populations than perhaps is the case in Australia. I mean, we Europeans seem to know who where their strategic risk is coming from. It's just a question of whether that then flows down to political action that actually, and whether it flows down to a preparedness to make sacrifices and make some of the adjustments that they clearly need to make. It's a slightly different question for Australia, and I think probably what we need to think about is: are we having an honest public conversation about the level of strategic risk that we face and what we need to do to deter it and where it's coming from? What do you want to just give me your thoughts on that? So, I mean, without getting into, say, partisan politics, I mean, I suppose it's just more the question of how ready is the Australian community, how
how active is that conversation at the moment? And I mean, are you concerned about that? And what do you feel needs to be done to improve it?
My very strong, long-standing view is that the political class has failed to be sufficiently honest with the Australian public about how dire our strategic moment is, how high the risk of conflict is, and how catastrophic the consequences of that would be, and therefore what is necessary and required to hopefully prevent that. And we should take very seriously the warnings of people like Sir Angus Houston, a very mild-mannered person with a lot of perspective and understanding of history. When he says this is the most dangerous moment in Australia's history since the end of World War II, he's not speaking in riddles. It's not hard to decipher what that means. And yet the response in public policy terms is nowhere near serious enough to meet the level of that threat. And defence spending is just one of those issues, but it is probably the most important. I suspect if the public really knew the state of the Australian Defence Force readiness, the risk of conflict and the consequences of conflict, they would be clamouring to politicians for us to do more and spend more and invest more to upgrade that capability and hopefully prevent that conflict from occurring. But I think, not unreasonably, they're busy with their lives. They have other preoccupations. They don't have time to consider in depth and in detail our state of defence readiness. And they just would assume that politicians who have better access to information to them, including classified intelligence, would be doing whatever is necessary to meet the strategic moment. And so if we tell them that 2% of GDP is sufficient, then they will believe us and they will trust us that that is right. But of course, everyone in the security and intelligence community knows that that's not enough, that we must do more, and that if we fail to do more, we may find ourselves in a very difficult position if events get out of our control.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I mean, it's no disrespect to sections of the Australian public that they are not across every detail of complicated foreign policy and strategic policy. They have their own issues to focus. I mean, there are a million things that I know nothing about. And I'm sure it's the case for a lot of other people who work in specific areas, and therefore it really is about the leadership, the political leadership, and also, I mean, whether it's the business community, the think tank community, various others who actually do need to communicate that. So let's just stick with defence spending then for a moment. What's the disparity right now, do you think, between the social license that's required to persuade Australians that they may need to make some trade-offs elsewhere? So, between where we are now and where we need to be in order to get to the sort of levels that I think you've advocated publicly for some time.
I mean, this is the challenge of public policy. There are inherent trade-offs in every decision you make, and that's none more obvious than when you're making budget decisions, because there is a finite amount of money that the federal government can spend, and every dollar you spend on one thing cannot be spent twice. And there are a lot of good causes that the community puts to government that gets debated around the table of an expenditure review committee, and difficult choices do have to be made between very worthy investment in social initiatives, for example, like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and defence spending. But defence spending is unique in that it is a form of insurance against a future risk. Not every form of government spending has that quality. And you can, in periods of history, underinvest in your defence and get away with it, just like you could with your own insurance. You could get lucky for a while, not have insurance on your home or your car. But if that moment of unexpected surprise occurs and you don't have adequate insurance to meet your needs, you find yourself in a very difficult position. And obviously, the stakes are much higher when you're talking about potential conflict in our region, which dispassionate, independent analysts have assessed to be potentially existential for Australia and countries like Australia in the Indo-Pacific if it were to occur. And so I think politicians, in a calm and measured way, need to bring the Australian public along with us for the journey and educate them about the nature of the risk without alarming them. There is no sense in alarming people, and it would be particularly harmful if we gave people a sense of fatalism, that things were so bad and so out of control that there was nothing we could do about it, because there are things that we can do. And sensible, timely investments can make a real contribution to a material deterrent effect that we intend to have along with our allies. But of course, the other element of that is it does require strong cohesion between our allies. And we do find ourselves in a moment of history where our principal security ally, the United States, is undergoing a very unconventional moment in its politics and is not resembling the traditional ally that it used to. In fact, that only strengthens the case even further for defence spending, whether you're a supporter of the US alliance as I am, whether you're a supporter of AUKUS as I am, or whether you're a critic of both. In any scenario going forward, whether Australia has to be completely self-reliant or whether we are reliant within an alliance structure with the United States, we're going to have to be spending more to meet the challenges that we face.
Yeah. Thank you. You've reminded me to check in on my home and car insurance because I'm not entirely sure where it's up to. That's some added benefit. You've and I want to come back to the US in a moment, but you mentioned that you're a classical liberal, and I don't want to get you into any kind of trouble here, but it just seems to any kind of rational observer that revenue and spending do need to be both considered, given the extent of uplift that we need in certain areas in national security. We probably can't cut our way elsewhere to getting to something like 3.5% of defence spending. I suppose one way to pose the question is: are we as an advanced democracy at the moment in Australia really kind of up for those hard discussions about trade-offs and sacrifice? So, one thing that concerns me is that we've lost that a little bit in our political discourse. Like, it's very tempting for political leaders to go to each election and say, we're going to promise you everything, we're not going to demand anything back from you, and that will actually need to change. But the tone, it can change over time, but it does need to evolve into something more like the sort of the JFK famous quote about ask not what your country can do for you, etc. Do you have views on that?
Yeah, I'm not just a classical liberal, I'm also the Shadow Finance Minister. And so by disposition, you would expect me to be hostile to any increase in government spending in any field, including defence spending. But I recognise where we are, and I accept the reality and the advice that we've had from our best informed experts that say we must do more and we must do it quickly. And so the challenge for people like me is to make the numbers add up, to add those sums up, and to be mindful that we face other important challenges in our economy that are not existential like our security challenges are, but they're pretty profound, like the productivity crisis that we face and the threat that poses to our living standards over the medium and long term, and the enormously disruptive technological changes that are coming with things like artificial intelligence. So my very strong starting point is that if we have a productivity crisis as we do in this country, if we have a business investment crisis as we do in this country, higher taxes are probably not the way you're going to solve that problem. And we do need a highly productive economy, both for its own sake and the virtue that brings in higher living standards, but also, frankly, to meet the burden of higher defence spending in the future. When you set a target as a percentage of GDP on defence spending, there are two ways that you can effectively finance that, and one is by growing the economy faster than you grow government, and we can have a very strong defence force if we have a strong growing economy. So I'm very reticent to open the door to a net tax increase, but we have said that we're in favour of tax reform and that we're open to a conversation with government about how we can raise revenue more efficiently in this country that's less distortionary. And we would be mature and bipartisan and constructive if the government wants to go down that road.
You raise an important point there about the role of technology in our future. Obviously, productivity growth. That's in a very serious circumstance at the moment. But broader GDP growth as well. There's been an economic reform roundtable recently that has touched on some of these issues. How do you? What's your sort of guiding North Star, I suppose, for how we integrate technology into our industry, into our economy in ways that mitigate and manage the risks that it will introduce, whether it's sort of cyber risks or, dependency and supply chain risks down the track, and ensuring that we don't actually see our national power and influence in the world gradually erode over the next 10, 20, 50 years by just missing the boat on some of these amazingly productive technologies. What's a sort of guiding principle that you try to follow on that?
Yeah, well, the history of economic growth is really instructive here. There are two things really which drive rapid increases in living standards. One is economic reform, and we had successful periods of that in the 80s and 90s in Australia. But you can only float the dollar once, you can only cut tariffs once, you can only privatise the Commonwealth Bank and Qantas once. And once those first big gains from economic reform happen, the future economic gains from reform are still achievable, but they're just not as dramatic. And so there are things we should do to reform public policy to make our economy more efficient, but the massive gains in productivity are unlikely to come from that route. The other way that you get significant economic growth and productivity growth is the deployment of new technology. And that requires investment, and we need to make ourselves an attractive place to invest. And it also requires policy settings which are encouraging of the adoption of new technology and the testing and exploration of new technology. My concern at the moment with artificial intelligence is there is a risk that jurisdictions like Australia do miss the boat and don't get the upsurge and the benefit to productivity that could come from the deployment of that technology, because our policy settings are not as encouraging as they should be for the technology. It's long been the case that the United States has been an engine room for this growth because they have very pro-investment, very pro-technology policy settings by default. Lower taxes, less regulation, an amazing, talented workforce that has come together in a perfect storm to create this amazing world-beating technology, where other jurisdictions in the world, notably the European Union, also have talent, also have lots of people, also have lots of money, but haven't produced anywhere near the levels of innovation because their public policy settings are much more hostile to it. So we can't afford to make that mistake, particularly as a relatively smaller economy in the world. And we want to play a really key role in having artificial intelligence adoption in Australia. So we need to make sure that all our policy settings are encouraging of that and not hostile to that. Otherwise, we will get left behind.
I think you're absolutely right about making sure that we don't miss the boat. What do you see as the key elements of that? There are obviously things like encouraging investment in the form of data centre construction here in Australia, and there are some interesting conversations going on around that. There's also the encouragement of integration by all industries of particularly AI and the impact that could have on jobs. And clearly that is going to increasingly raise some concerns among the electorate as well. I mean, I suppose, what do you see as the sort of the key pillars of getting a balanced policy right that encourages investment, that encourages deployment, but doesn't create risks either in the form of unemployment, which could have all sorts of political and social impacts, or some sort of rise of populism, or expose us to the supply chain or the cyber risks as well.
Yeah, so Australia's does have significant AI innovation occurring, but we're not the primary source of development of new AI technology or software. And so effectively in this world, we are a price taker, and we can't afford to make ourselves unattractive for investment of these global firms who can choose to base their technology and their workers and their data centers anywhere in the world. And so what do we need to make that attractive? We need to make sure that they can generate a safe and stable return on investment for their deployed capital. And they will want assurances around taxation levels and protection of intellectual property and other important things. We can make ourselves an attractive place to build data centers to process it. And that means having predictable planning laws, affordable energy, high quality workforce. And we also need to make sure that the rollout of that technology, once it is here, is not impeded by unreasonable demands, for example, that have been made by the union movement, that workers in a workplace should be able to veto the rollout of AI in a particular workplace. I mean, that would just guarantee that firm became uncompetitive as its competitors rolled out that technology, and all of those jobs will be lost. But you're also right that Australians and people all around the world are anxious about what AI means for them. Is it going to make their job redundant? Is it going to have other sorts of unappealing social consequences when it comes to safety and security and exploitation of children? And it's really important that we reassure people of that. And frankly, the technology industry has a very important responsibility to play in responsible deployment of this technology to reassure the public. It's critically important that business leaders are sensitive to workforce needs and don't set this up as a one versus the other. We don't need a zero-sum game here, and it shouldn't need to be that way. It's also really important that tech platforms are responsible in the way they design this technology. We saw a scandal when Reuters reported about a month ago that Meta, in the training of one of its chatbot AIs, had instructed the AI to allow it to engage in flirtatious, sexualized conversations with underage children. Now, this wasn't a rogue output from a model that was unpredicted. This was actually human-initiated direction from engineers and the developers at Meta as to how they wanted the chatbot to operate. That's incredibly reckless and irresponsible. And if companies make bad choices like that, then they can expect governments to respond with really deleterious regulation, which will make it much harder for them to operate.
Yeah, no, absolutely, fair enough. I mean, you've talked a little bit there about the removal of obstacles. What about sort of active government incentives? It seems that has to be another significant part of it. I think our private R&D investment as a proportion of GDP has been low for years and years. Of course, Silicon Valley famously benefited from a lot of sort of government input in its early days. So, it's not some sort of libertarian created wonderland as it's sometimes made out to be. I mean, what do you see as the role? And again, what do you see as the sort of broad parameters for more active government encouragement of things like adoption and integration?
Well, in addition to my responsibilities as Shadow Minister for Finance, I'm also Shadow Minister for the Public Service and Shadow Minister for Government Services. And there is enormous potential to revolutionise the delivery of services to the public by government by adopting technology like AI. It could both significantly improve the efficiency of that delivery of services by removing those repetitive tasks and allowing public servants to focus on those higher order tasks and reasoning that only a human being should ever do. And it can potentially significantly improve the user experience on the other end by making the system far more easy to navigate and far more intuitive than it currently is. So government has a really important leadership role to play here in adopting this technology and rolling out and demonstrating that it can be done safely. We shouldn't be wild in our experimentation with these things because there are very sensitive systems and very sensitive public services like the Australian Taxation Office and Centrelink and Medicare, which need to be very carefully managed from a privacy and security point of view. But we shouldn't allow fear of getting it wrong stop us from trying to get it right, because I think there really is huge potential, and it should pave the way for other employers and other businesses to do the same.
So you can potentially improve governance, build trust with the broader community and the private sector. And what does that include? Having the federal government as an anchor customer in some ways as well, to from the point of view of Australian businesses, startups or scale-ups?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are government agencies which are already experimenting with this with some success in Australia, but also overseas. There are some impressive examples of time-saving technology that's been introduced, which has really improved the efficiency of public services, and some which have also improved that user experience as well. It's very difficult for the public to navigate government services often. They often come to their members of parliament to effectively provide a concierge service so they know who to talk to about what thing. And really, it shouldn't be that complex. We should have an ambition of making it easier to navigate. And this technology offers a potential to do that if we do get it right.
Is it fair to say, though, if we're risk averse on all of these things, I mean, it seems to me that, really technological capability equals national power. I mean, that's always been the case to some extent. Obviously, countries in previous centuries that invented whether it's gunpowder or these sorts of things. I mean, I'm talking specifically there about weaponry, but it goes beyond that. But really, technology power is national power. I mean, that we do risk if we are risk averse, then we face the peril of becoming a kind of an economic and political backwater.
That's exactly right. I gave a speech at the American Enterprise Institute a couple of years ago on exactly this topic. The reason why the United States and its allies won the Cold War is because they won the economic arms race and the technology arms race. And this technology, AI, but also quantum and other emerging technologies, will be at least as decisive on the geopolitical contest of the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. And if it's authoritarian states who successfully develop and deploy this technology before democracies do, it will be them that get not just economic advantages, but also military and strategic advantages as well. And we have to remember in this contest that they are not bound by the same conventions that we are. They are not rule of law democracies. They do not have the same regard for individual rights and freedoms. They do not have the same regard for privacy or intellectual property or any of those things. And so in many ways, we have a very fierce competitor who will not be bound by the rules. And that means we must make sure our systems are geared towards competing with them and mindful that this is of strategic importance, not just economic importance.
So that's a great segue into issues like TikTok, which you've spoken and dealt with through the Parliament and through committees a lot. Talk to me a little bit about how we balance the adoption of new technologies coming from authoritarian countries. So we can focus on China a little bit here. Obviously, it is technologically competitive with the United States at the moment. TikTok was a good kind of case study of how, without active government regulation or without active government policy, it was very easy for that to become highly integrated into not just our sort of social interactions, but our economic interactions as well. A lot of people were actually using it for business purposes, and so that was a test case of where we perhaps went too far down a kind of a dependency before people started to wake up to the fact that this was creating a risk. Just talk to me a little bit about how you see China's increasing technological prowess as creating risks for Australia, including in terms of the dependencies that we might actually start to form on powerful technologies. DeepSeek is another good example. That even if they don't pose a sort of defined national security risk to us, although they may well do that, they also create dependencies which create longer-term strategic risks for us.
Well, social media platforms today are the public square in democracies where issues get debated, where consensus is formed and public policy is influenced and ultimately decided in elections. And they perform the same role today that a television station or a newspaper or a radio would have in the 20th century. And if someone had proposed in the 20th century that we should allow our public forums to be controlled by an authoritarian foreign government, if the Soviet Union proposed buying a television station in Australia, people would have thought you were completely mad and that should never be permitted. But effectively, without making any conscious decision at all, we've allowed that to happen just through rapidly successful startups like TikTok, but not only TikTok. And now we have handed over control over our public square to companies that are directly influenced by authoritarian foreign governments. And that comes back to your very first question about the dilemmas for democracies in making hard choices when authoritarian states want to make those hard choices even more difficult. So when we have difficult debates about spending more on defence and less on social care, for example, why would you allow a foreign government to dictate the terms or influence the terms of that debate through a social media platform they control? It makes it even harder for a democracy to achieve consensus and make difficult decisions in a contested strategic environment and a contested information environment. So I think there's a very strong case for democracies to be assertive about which social media platforms we allow to operate in our jurisdiction and under what conditions. And I was very attracted to the model before the US Congress that contemplated separating TikTok from its parent company ByteDance to sever the link between the company and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that is subject to the ultimate implementation of the Trump administration. We should continue to watch that very closely. But I've said on the record for many years that if the Trump administration, if the US administration is successful in ensuring a safer version of TikTok is available to Americans, free from the influence of an authoritarian foreign government, Australians should want to have access to that too. And I hope that our government will be working closely with the US administration as they settle these issues to make sure we're part of that solution.
How dismayed are you that that has not gone the way that the Congress actually voted that it should go?
Look, I think it is a really interesting case study in the relationship between the executive presidency and the legislature in the United States. And I'm a former congressional intern, and I've studied that with great interest from an academic perspective. And I won't weigh on indirectly on how the US administration seeks to navigate these issues. But the Trump administration itself has just continued to defer that deadline for the enforcement of that law and spared prosecution of the technology platforms that continue to host TikTok, effectively in defiance of an act of Congress. And that will have to come to a resolution of some kind at some point. That can't continue in perpetuity, even in the US system. And so it'll be very important to see where that lands. There's been some reporting coming out of the administration that they think that there is a possible deal there that a US technology company can take a majority stake in a US headquartered, TikTok platform, that there can be structural separation. Those details will be really important because the Biden administration tried for the best part of 4 years to negotiate a settlement with TikTok that was called Project Texas that would have achieved that. And ultimately, the intelligence community advising the Biden administration advised them that it wasn't going to be possible to have sufficient degree of confidence that there wouldn't be that ultimate influence from the parent company.
Yeah. Let's broaden it out a little bit on the economic security issue. We've talked for years about the need for diversification, and that was turbocharged by both, I suppose, COVID and also the period of economic coercion from China. So, both in the sense of our supply chains and our export destinations. How do you think we're actually going on following through on a lot of that rhetoric that we've been engaged in for a long time?
Well, this is a shared problem between the business community and the government, and we have to work together to solve this problem. I don't ever want to live in a society or an economy where the government directs trade and tells companies, outside exceptions where we have sanctions, obviously, that they should trade at a lesser price with some country because that's preferable to the government of the time. That's not a free market, economy, and that's not a road to prosperity for a country like Australia, which is an open trading economy. But by the same token, I think we've all learnt lessons both from the COVID pandemic and China's economic coercion that it is not healthy or strategic to have so much dependence on either the export front or, frankly, on the import front either from a country which is willing to link economics and trade to politics and geostrategic issues and willing to wield leverage over the economy to achieve political outcomes. And so the best thing that politicians can do is help clear the pathway with as many other jurisdictions in the world through free trade agreements so that exporters have other choices. And I'm dismayed by the failure to conclude an European Union free trade agreement between Australia and the EU that has even more strategic merit today than it ever has. It also has very strong economic merit, and the failure to resolve that has been, I think, one of the significant trade failures of this government, which they should seek to remedy. Particularly because they came to government promising to conclude it within 12 months and clearly haven't done so. And then I think we also need to think about what other measures of resilience do we need on the other side of the equation, which is on our imports. We never want to be dependent on a country that could withhold imports from us that we need to operate in a time of crisis. And we have to think about what are the steps we can take to make our economy more resilient to those sort of shocks.
I love the fact that you are still committed to basic ideas of, sort of open economies and, again, those classical liberal principles. And I share a lot of them myself. I suppose, and you've addressed this to some extent, but how many sacrifices are we going to have to make, do you think, over the next decade or two on those principles which are clearly beneficial? I mean, I'm not an economist and I don't have great knowledge of economics, but I understand enough about comparative advantage to recognize that that trade has been enormously prosperous. Trade within a set of rules has been enormously beneficial for the whole world. I mean, how do you feel, given your sort of philosophical background, about the degree to which we're going to have to put aside some of those principles and accept some, sort of just hard-headed decisions that if they're going to do it to us, we're going to have to respond in turn in some way?
We have to be very judicious about how we do this, because we could find ourselves in a situation where every industry comes to Canberra cap in hand, making an argument that they're strategically important and they deserve government intervention and assistance to protect them, to protect the nation. And if we follow that through to its logical conclusion, we end up with an economy that's closed off from the world and far poorer than it could otherwise be. But the other side of that coin is that resilience is deterrence. If we are more resilient and our adversaries know that we're more resilient, that will make them think twice before engaging us in conflict and threatening our interests. Conversely, if we're seen to be vulnerable and dependent, that increases the risk of conflict in the future that we are not in a position to respond to, because our adversaries look at these things very closely. And they look at it in terms of our ability to sustain our economy in a time of crisis. Could we continue to fuel our economy? Could we continue to provide medicines and other essential services to our citizens? But they also look at it in terms of our things like our critical infrastructure and their cyber vulnerabilities. And so one of the things I had to grapple with as Intelligence Committee Chair in the previous government was, how much more power should we give government over private companies that run infrastructure, which is systemically important to our country because of their cyber vulnerabilities, because we had intelligence in the open source, which told us that foreign nation states were looking to damage those or weaponize those vulnerabilities and damage those services to weaken us as a country. And we had to accept that there was a trade-off there, that we had to accept a greater role for the state in directing private companies to invest better in their own cyber defenses, because they didn't just have a duty to their shareholders and their employees and their customers. They had a broader duty to the economy because they are systemically important. And so we have to have lots of those conversations. We shouldn't allow mission creep, because if everything becomes critical, then nothing is critical. We have to choose the things that are most critical, and we don't want to become a centrally planned state economy. But there is a role for government in assessing the risk, assessing the strategic environment, and directing private sector within limits to do things to protect themselves from it.
I'm conscious of time, but I did promise to come back to the United States. I mean, you mentioned I can't remember if it was unpredictability or uncertainty was the term that you used, but I mean, recognizing the sort of dual issues of the importance of the alliance, in fact, the indispensability of the alliance to Australia's strategic position, our need to do more, to share some more of the burden through things like increased defence spending. But then the question of reliability of the United States and its and the president's proclivity for sometimes treating allies and adversaries as interchangeable, I suppose. Sometimes feeling as if something like tariffs can actually be sort of punitive. Of course, we've got AUKUS on the table as well, hopefully with a positive decision coming soon. I mean, recognizing that you're more constrained on this than I am, just give me your sort of broad assessment of, just how difficult those sorts of balances are going to be to manage over the next 3 years or so.
Yeah, look, I'm very fond of the United States. I've lived there twice. I've visited probably more than 30 times. I have good relationships with friends in Congress and think tank community and the administration. But anybody can recognise that this is an unconventional administration, which is pursuing a non-traditional foreign policy, and it has raised questions in lots of US allies about its reliability. Now, I'm very much of the school that the response to that is that we should double down on the alliance, that it is indispensable, and that we need to make some very big contributions towards that alliance in the form of higher defence spending, which is a key concern of not just this administration, but actually previous US administrations, including Democratic administrations, that they want better burden sharing with their allies, and they want us to take our responsibility as part of collective deterrence to make a meaningful contribution to that and not to free ride on their attempts to do so. And I think we should double down on AUKUS. We should accelerate the timelines for delivery of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say that the US alliance is, no matter what we do, can't be relied upon, that AUKUS is going to be withdrawn from us in some future. Well, the answer is still the same. We still need to spend more on defence and become more self-reliant and protect our own interests more by doing more for ourselves. Whether you believe in the US alliance or are a skeptic of the US alliance, the strategic environment is what dictates what we need to do, not just what our allies' posture might be. And so if we want to try and find our way in the world without Americans, it's going to be a lot more than 3% of GDP that we'll be spending. But I think there's a way that we can find our way within the alliance that upholds the alliance. That also means Australia does our fair share of the burden sharing, but it will require a big lift in defence spending to do that.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I very much hope that you're correct on that. All right, I'm going to wrap it up with just a question about looking forward to the future. I mean, without sort of, it's cheaply personalising it. I mean, you and I think both have relatively young families. We think obviously about not just what our own children are going to do and what kind of future they're going to face, but all young Australians. How confident or concerned are you that kids today are going to grow up in a country that is secure, that is reasonably prosperous, that has a kind of standard of living that you and I and perhaps our parents enjoyed? I mean, there does seem to be some sort of reasonable questions about that, and it's for the first, it's basically reversing historical trends that we've come to take for granted for at least a couple of generations since probably the 1945 period. What are your feelings about that?
I am optimistic, but my optimism is much more measured and guarded and cautious than it would have been if you had have asked me that question 5 or 10 years ago. We do face some very serious headwinds, both strategically, which is my overwhelming concern, but also economically. And future generations, including my children and your children, should be more prosperous and more wealthy than our generation has been if we navigate this period well and if we take advantage of the opportunities that present us with new technology. But they face some obstacles that previous generations did not, chiefly, participating in the economic system in our country of getting onto the housing market, building wealth for their families, having aspiration and getting ahead. And there is intergenerational despair in this country right now, and all the public polling demonstrates that young people are very pessimistic about their own personal prospects and about the prospects of our country. And I think we have an urgent national task to restore that sense of hope and optimism to younger generations. They deserve to be hopeful, not optimistic about the future, but it depends on the choices we make to prioritise their interests, to give them opportunities so that they do inherit a country from us that is stronger, that is more secure, and that is more free, and that should be all of our ambition.
I mean, political schisms are always bad, but it feels like an intergenerational political schism could be like one of the worst things that a democracy could possibly face.
Edmund Burke said a society is a compact between the living and the dead and the yet to be born. And if that breaks down, it is utterly corrosive to democracies in particular. And we do have to deal with what is actually rising intergenerational resentment, where young people feel that older generations have prospered at their expense. That doesn't have to be true, but we do have to make active policy decisions that, for example, make it easier for them to get into the housing market, that make it easier for them to build wealth for themselves and family, that gives them that hope of aspiration again. Otherwise, that resentment will grow and is a recipe for a divided society, not a strong and cohesive society. And at a time in the world where we need to be strong and we need to be cohesive, where there are so many pressures, this is one pressure that we have to deal with quite urgently. Because I am worried that young people feel so disillusioned by the system that they're opting out of it. And you can see it in their voting patterns when they vote for more extreme and marginal parties. And that's not just the case in Australia, but all around the Western world. But you can see it just from their disengagement with the political system at all. And the reason for that's understandable. If they feel like the system is not working in their interest, well, what is their interest in preserving a system which has actually worked very well for us to date?
I love a good Edmund Burke quote, and that's a belter. So thank you. Great chat, James. I really appreciate your time. That's a very fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That's all we have time for today on Stop the World. We'll be back with another episode later this week.